Hello, dark and twisty listeners. You might hear a bit of a storm raging in the background here. There's a big storm coming to Northern California and it's pounding on my windows a little bit. And my dog is at my feet in my booth because she's frightened of the storm. It's a story about a stormy night, so that's kind of fitting. So we're going to see if we can get through this short story. Ah, there you are. Pull up a chair by the fireside. I'm going to tell you a story, but it's not for the faint of heart. My name is Julia Norton, and you're listening to Dark and Twisty Tales, a weekly telling of the lesser-known and more grisly folk stories and fairy tales. Are you sitting comfortably? Then I shall begin. My own self. In a tiny house in the North Countrie, far away from any town or village, there lived not long ago a poor widow all alone with her little son, a 6-year-old boy. The house door opened straight onto the hillside, and all round about were moorlands and huge stones and swampy hollows. Never a house nor a sign of life wherever you might look, for the nearest neighbours were in the ferlies, in the glen below, and the the-wisps in the long grass along the pathside. And many a tale she could tell of the good folk calling to each other in the oak trees, and the twinkling lights hopping onto the very window-sill on dark nights. But in spite of the loneliness, she lived on from year to year in the little house, perhaps because she was never asked to pay rent for it. But she did not care to sit up late when the fire burnt low and no one knew what might be about. So, when they had their supper, she would make up a good fire and go off to bed, so that if anything terrible did happen, she could always hide her head under the bedclothes. This, however, was far too early to please her little son, so when she called him to bed, he would go on playing beside the fire, as if he did not hear. He had always been bad to do with since the day he was born, and his mother did not often care to cross him. Indeed, the more she tried to make him obey her, the less heed he paid to anything she said. So it usually ended by his taking his own way. But one night, just at the fore end of winter, the widow could not make up her mind to go off to bed and leave him playing by the fireside. For the wind was tugging at the door and rattling the window panes, and well she knew that on such a night fairies and such like were bound to be out and about and bent on mischief. So she tried to coax the boy into going to bed at once. "The safest bed to bide in, such a night as this," she said. But no, he wouldn't. Then she threatened to give him the stick, but it was of no use. The more she begged and scolded, the more he shook his head, and when at last she lost patience and cried that the fairies would surely come and fetch him away, he only laughed and said he wished they would, for he'd like to play with one. At that, his mother burst into tears and went off to bed in despair, certain that after such words something dreadful would happen, while her naughty little son sat on his stool by the fire, not at all put out by her crying. But he had not long been sitting there alone when he heard a fluttering sound near him in the chimney, and presently, down by his side, dropped the tiniest wee girl you could think of. She was not a span high, and had hair like spun silver, eyes as green as grass, and cheeks red as June roses. The little boy looked at her with surprise. "Oh," said he, "what do they call ye?" "My own self," she said in a shrill but sweet little voice, and she looked at him too. "And what do they call ye?" "Just my own self too," he answered cautiously, and with that they began to play together. She certainly showed him some fine games, She made animals out of the ashes that looked and moved like life, and trees with green leaves waving over tiny houses with men and women an inch high in them, who, when she breathed on them, fell into walking and talking quite properly. But the fire was getting low and the light dim, and presently the little boy stirred the coals with a stick to make them blaze, when out jumped a red-hot cinder, and where should it fall but on the fairy child's tiny foot? Thereupon she set up such a squeal that the boy dropped the stick and clapped his hands to his ears, but it grew to so shrill a screech that it was like all the wind in the world whistling through one tiny keyhole. There was a sound in the chimney again, but this time the little boy did not wait to see what it was, but bolted off to bed, where he hid under the blankets and listened in fear and trembling to what went on. A voice came from the chimney, speaking sharply.
"Who's there, and what's wrong?" it said. "It's my own self,"
sobbed the fairy child.
"And my foot's burnt sore. Oh!" "Who did it?"
said the voice angrily, and this time it sounded nearer, and the boy, peeping from under the clothes, could see a white face looking out from the chimney opening.
Just my own self too,"
said the fairy child again.
"Then if you did it your own self,"
cried the elf mother shrilly,
"what's the use of making all this fuss about?"
And with that she stretched out a long thin arm and caught the creature by its ear, and shaking it roughly pulled it in after her, out of sight and up the chimney. The little boy lay awake a long time, listening, in case the fairy mother should come back after all. And next evening after supper, his mother was surprised to find that he was willing to go to bed whenever she liked. "He's taken a turn for the better at last," she said to herself. But he was thinking just then that when next a fairy came to play with him, he might not get off quite so easily as he had done this time. By the moon we sport and play, with the night begins our day. As we frisk, the dew doth fall, sleep little urchins all. Sleep little urchins all. Lightly as the little bee, 2 by 2 and 3 by 3, and about go we, and about go we. By the moon we sport and play, with the night begins our day. As we frisk, the dew doth fall, sleep little urchins all. Sleep little urchins all. Thank you for listening to Dark and Twisty Tales. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe on iTunes, rate, review, and share with all your friends. You can also get more information about me, Julia Norton, at julianorton.com. So, until the next time, bye. Bye.